The water was calm, but beneath the surface, something was shifting. A Chinese naval vessel had moved into position near one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean on the planet. Not by accident, not on a routine patrol. This was calculated. This was deliberate. And the Americans were watching every single move. What unfolded over the following hours would send a message not just to Beijing, but to every nation with eyes on the Persian Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow choke point where roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through daily, had just become the stage for one of the most tense military standoffs of the modern era. And most people had no idea it was even happening. But here is what makes this story different from everything you have heard before. This was not just about ships. This was not just about oil. This was a direct test, a probe, a calculated move by China to see exactly how far it could push before America pushed back. The answer it received was not what it expected. To understand why this moment matters so much, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually means to the world. Imagine a corridor of water so narrow that, in some places, it is barely 33 kilometers wide. Now imagine that through this corridor flows enough oil to power Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa every single day. Saudi Arabia ships through here. Iraq ships through here. The UAE, Kuwait, Iran. Every barrel of Gulf oil that reaches the global market passes through this single point. If that corridor closes, even for a week, oil prices do not just rise, they explode. Stock markets react within hours. Supply chains built over decades begin to fracture. Governments that depend on cheap energy start making desperate decisions. This is why every major military power on Earth watches the Strait of Hormuz like a hawk. And this is exactly why China chose it, because controlling the narrative around Hormuz is not just about military strength. It is about economic leverage over the entire planet. China's naval expansion over the last 15 years has been one of the most dramatic military buildups in modern history. In 2010, China had a regional navy. Today, it operates the largest fleet by number of vessels on Earth. Aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers, nuclear submarines, and a network of overseas logistics facilities stretching from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean and now creeping toward the Gulf. This was not built for defense. Every analyst who has studied the data, every satellite image, every intercepted communication points to the same conclusion. China is building a navy capable of projecting power far beyond its own shores. And the Persian Gulf, with its oil wealth and its choke point geography, has been circled on Beijing's strategic map for years. But circling something on a map and actually moving assets into that space are two very different things. When Chinese naval vessels began appearing in greater frequency near Hormuz, it raised alarms in Washington that went far beyond the usual diplomatic concern. This was not a flag-showing exercise. This was positioning. And the timing was not coincidental. The United States had been watching tensions rise in the region for months. Iran had been making increasingly aggressive moves in the Gulf, seizing vessels, harassing commercial shipping, pushing the boundaries of what the international community would tolerate. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, had been responding with increased patrols and a stronger visible presence. But then something shifted. Intelligence reports began flagging a pattern that nobody wanted to say out loud. Chinese naval movements were beginning to align, not perfectly, not obviously, but align with Iranian provocation windows. When Iran moved, Chinese vessels were nearby. When the U.S. repositioned assets, Chinese surveillance ships adjusted their positions accordingly. This was coordination. Or at minimum, it was intelligence sharing at a level that had never been seen in this theater before. And then came the incident that changed the entire calculus. A U.S. carrier strike group was conducting operations in the northern Arabian Sea, close enough to Hormuz to matter. Standard procedure, standard. The kind of presence the U.S. has maintained in this region for decades to reassure allies and deter adversaries. But this time, a Chinese Type 055 destroyer, one of the most advanced surface combatants in the world, moved to intercept. Not in a collision course, not with weapons hot, but close, uncomfortably close. In maritime terms, what followed was a shadow operation. The Chinese vessel began mirroring the movements of the American strike group, maintaining a proximity that forced constant communication between the two fleets and put every sailor on edge. This is a tactic China has used before in the South China Sea. It is designed to do several things simultaneously. First, it gathers real-time intelligence on American operational patterns. Second, it forces the U.S. into a reactive posture. Third, and most importantly, it signals to regional observers that China is present, capable, and willing to operate inside American defense perimeters without flinching. What most people do not realize is that this kind of operation is not just a military message. It is a political one. It tells every Gulf state watching from the shore that the United States is no longer the only superpower with a presence in these waters. That calculation matters enormously in a region where perception is power. But here's where things take a serious turn. The Americans had anticipated this move. Not this specific incident, but the broader strategic pattern. And they had prepared a response that was designed not just to counter China's play, but to make a statement loud enough to echo in Beijing. Within hours of the Chinese vessel's shadow operation beginning, the U.S. activated a layered response that demonstrated something China's military planners had been hoping to avoid confirming. American dominance in this theater was not just about aircraft carriers. It was about systems integration, electronic warfare capability, undersea assets, and above all, the ability to coordinate across multiple domains simultaneously in ways that no other navy on Earth can currently match. A second carrier strike group that had been operating under communications, silence in the region, made its presence known. Submarine assets that had been tracking the Chinese destroyer for days surfaced their electronic signatures, just enough to confirm they had been there all along. Aerial surveillance assets that had been invisible to Chinese radar systems suddenly made themselves visible, a deliberate choice, a message, a demonstration. You were never as alone out there as you thought. The Chinese destroyer did not escalate. It adjusted its position, maintained professional maritime distance, and the immediate standoff de-escalated. But the message had been received, processed, and logged in naval headquarters from Beijing to Washington. What happened next changed everything about how analysts understand China's Gulf strategy. In the days following the incident, Chinese state media was unusually quiet. There were no triumphant declarations about standing up to American hegemony, no viral videos of Chinese sailors confronting U.S. forces, no commentary from military officials about asserting China's right to operate in international waters. Silence in Chinese state media is never accidental. It is always a choice, and the choice to say nothing told the world something important. The operation had not gone the way Beijing had hoped. The intelligence gathered was real, but the demonstration of American capability in response had created an uncomfortable data point for Chinese military planners. The gap between Chinese naval ambition and American naval dominance in contested waters was still wide enough to matter. But here is the thing about China's strategy that makes it so dangerous to underestimate. Beijing does not need to win today. It needs to learn. Every confrontation, every close encounter, every shadow operation is a data collection exercise. China is building a picture, piece by piece, of exactly where American capabilities are strongest and where the edges are softer. The Hormuz incident was not a failure for China. It was a lesson. And that is far more concerning than a victory would have been. To truly understand what is at stake here, you have to zoom out and look at the broader competition unfolding across the Indo-Pacific and the Gulf simultaneously. China has spent years cultivating relationships with Gulf states that the United States once considered firmly in its camp. The massive infrastructure investments under the Belt and Road Initiative have woven Chinese economic presence into the fabric of countries from Pakistan to the UAE. Chinese telecommunications companies have built networks across the region. Chinese state banks have financed ports, highways, and energy facilities. This is the other half of the strategy that military analysts often underweight. The naval presence near Hormuz is not operating in isolation. It is the hard power component of a soft power architecture that has been quietly assembled over 2 decades. When a Gulf state sees Chinese warships operating confidently in waters near its shores, while simultaneously having Chinese companies managing its ports and Chinese technology powering its cities, the strategic calculus begins to shift. Dependence creates leverage. Leverage creates options. And options are exactly what China is building, not just in the Gulf, but everywhere American power has historically gone unchallenged. Iran, of course, is the wild card that neither Beijing nor Washington can fully control. Tehran has watched the growing Chinese naval presence with a mixture of satisfaction and calculation. On one level, China's willingness to operate near Hormuz complicates American freedom of action in a way that benefits Iran strategically. Every Chinese vessel that the U.S. has to track and respond to is attention and resources diverted from monitoring Iranian activity. But Iran is not naive about what China actually wants from the region. Beijing does not want Iranian dominance of the Gulf any more than it wants American dominance. What China wants is a multipolar Gulf where no single power, including the United States, can dictate terms. Iran is useful to China as a disruptor, as a pressure point, as a lever, but Iran is not a partner in any meaningful strategic sense from Beijing's perspective. This creates a triangular tension near Hormuz that is genuinely unstable. 3 major powers with overlapping and conflicting interests, operating in a geography where miscalculation carries catastrophic consequences. A tanker seized by mistake. A warning shot misread. A vessel that gets too close in poor visibility. The Strait of Hormuz does not have much margin for error. And right now, the number of actors operating in that margin has never been higher. Back in Washington, the response to the Hormuz incident triggered a strategic review that went beyond naval deployment schedules. The core question being asked at the highest levels was not how to respond to China's next move near Hormuz. That question is operational, and the military handles it. The deeper question, the one that keeps senior officials awake, is whether the United States has the political will and the economic bandwidth to sustain its dominant position in the Gulf indefinitely while simultaneously managing a rising China in the Pacific and supporting commitments in Europe. The honest answer, the one that does not appear in official statements, is that the United States is being stretched. Not broken, not outmatched, but stretched. And China knows it. Every theater where the U.S. has to commit forces and attention is a theater where resources are diverted from somewhere else. The Pacific, the Gulf, Europe, all three are active simultaneously in ways that have not been seen since the Cold War. And unlike the Cold War, where the Soviet Union was primarily a land power with limited ability to project naval force globally, China is building exactly the kind of blue water navy capable of contesting American presence in multiple oceans at the same time. This is the strategic trap that the Hormuz incident represents in its most distilled form. Not one confrontation between two warships, but a preview of a world where American dominance can no longer be assumed to be automatic in any theater. The U.S. military response near Hormuz was powerful. It was professional, and by all accounts, it achieved its immediate objective of demonstrating that American capability in that theater remains formidable. But capability is only one variable in the equation. The other variable is commitment, and commitment in democracies is shaped by public opinion, by political cycles, by budget battles, and by the very human tendency to look away from slow-moving crises until they become acute ones. China's leadership operates on a different timeline. The decisions being made in Beijing about naval expansion, about Gulf presence, about testing American responses near Hormuz, these are not decisions made for the next election cycle. They are decisions made for the next 20 years. The patience built into the Chinese strategic approach is itself a form of power that Western analysis consistently underestimates. When the Chinese destroyer pulled back from its shadow operation near Hormuz, it was not admitting defeat. It was completing a data collection mission. The logs were full. The intelligence was valuable. And somewhere in a naval planning center, the lessons of that encounter were already being incorporated into the design of the next generation of Chinese surface combatants. For the Gulf states watching all of this unfold, the stakes are deeply personal. Countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar have built their security architectures around American military guarantees. The presence of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the American air bases scattered across the peninsula, the training relationships, the weapon sales, all of it is built on the assumption that when things get serious, America shows up and America wins. The Hormuz incident did not shatter that assumption, but it complicated it. When regional leaders see China operating confidently in waters near their shores, when they see that the American response, while effective, is no longer instantaneous or unchallenged, they begin to think about hedging, not abandoning the American alliance, not running into China's arms, but creating options, building relationships, ensuring that if the global order shifts, they are not left standing on the wrong side of a line that has moved without warning. This hedging is already happening. It is visible in the diplomatic movements, in the trade deals and the infrastructure agreements, in the quiet, careful repositioning of countries that have learned through centuries of history that the only constant in the Gulf is change. Here is what you need to carry with you after watching this. The confrontation near Hormuz was not a crisis, not yet, but it was a signal. A flare fired into the sky over the world's most critical waterway, illuminating for one brief moment the shape of a competition that will define the next generation of global power. China tested America, it gathered information, it learned, and it will return. America responded, it demonstrated capability, it sent a message, and it knows that messages, no matter how powerful, require constant reinforcement. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane, it is a mirror, and right now the reflection it is showing the world is of two great powers circling each other in the dark water, each convinced that the other will eventually blink. The question that nobody can answer yet is which one is right. And the answer to that question will shape everything. Oil prices, military alliances, the flow of global trade, the balance of power in a region that has never been more important or more dangerous. The water near Hormuz looks calm again today, but beneath the surface, something is always moving, and the next test is already being planned.